Elohim. Kumah, 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 kumah Elohim. Kumah, 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 kumah Elohim. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ. מקום, 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 מקום אלוהים. מקום, 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 מקום אלוהים. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good to see you all. So many people. Wow. So many people from Germany. I see Ali here. From the East Village, I see Tom. From Canada, I see Diane. Yes, and from all over, it's really, I mean, bravo to all of us for succeeding on getting up in time to be on Zoom at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. That's my first message to you all. Thank you so much for being here. So we're here to celebrate or to mark something called Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, or Chag Ha'atzmaut, Independence Holiday. Whether we love it or hate it, or for most of us, I think both is probably more appropriate. The state of Israel, which turned 73 this week, is central to our being in the world as Jews. The fact that we live in this rarest of times in which such a political entity like the Jewish state exists actually puts a responsibility on us to be part of the story of that place. It also compels us to know certain pieces of its reality. We we are compelled to know the reality over there so that we could participate in the story of this place. Today, we're going to dive in and explore one piece of the reality of this story. And we have a few people with us here today who are going to help us. Primarily my Abba, David Shulman, who you guys can see in one of the boxes maybe. We have Gili Getz with us. I'll give them a deeper introduction soon. And we have Gabriel Zucker, who's gonna bring us into this musically. But I want to keep going on this theme of story and reality, because that's really a big piece of my dad, is this relationship, I would say, between story and reality. One of his most famous one of my favorite books of his is called More Than Real. And in that book, he very convincingly manages to argue that art, poetry, dance, those kinds of things are far more real than what we're used to calling reality. His life in many ways mirrors and reflects the story of the state of Israel. And for sure, it mirrors and reflects the story of the relationship between American Jews and Israel. Many of us, I believe. So I want to tell you a little bit about his life as a kind of introduction to this day. He was born just a few months after the state was created in Waterloo, Iowa, where he was taught by my Savta, his mother, Savta Dina, Zichronah Livracha, that the word Jewish, what that means is that we were led out of slavery in Egypt, and because of that, we know what it feels like to be a slave. We know what it feels like to be an immigrant. We know what it feels like to be poor and to be different. The state of Israel, to my dad at the time, it was Jewish, which meant it was ethical, it was loving, it was a miracle. So in June of 1967, after this rather miraculous victory of the Six-Day War, the War of 1967, he told his parents that he's not going to the fancy university that he's gotten accepted into, and instead he's going to Hebrew University. And they argued about it for, I think the story is about half a day. My dad's smiling, so I think that sounds about right. And by the end of the day, his father, Saba Chaim, succumbed, and that's where he went. So he came filled with hope, filled with love of God and love of Judaism, but he quickly encountered a very complex reality, a very different kind of reality. By 1982, he was a soldier in the Israeli army. He was serving as a medic in the Lebanon War, a war in which he did not believe. During that war, there were protests against the war in which a friend of his was killed by another Jew. Emil Grinsweig was his name. And then he became active in the peace movement. And as he did that, he watched his three boys, Tari, my older brother, me, and my younger brother, Idan, serve for 3 years in the army, in the Israeli army. I personally served in Lebanon for 3 years under Prime Minister Netanyahu. I was Netanyahu's soldier for 3 years. You can imagine what that felt like for him. And not only that, but not only his politics were shifted, but his Jewish practice shifted, so that instead of the kind of praying person that I imagine him to have been at the time when he first came, when he would agree to come, for example, on Yom Kippur to synagogue, he would sit there with his Sanskrit books. And still does, actually, when he finds himself at a synagogue, Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu, that's his line of work. He's quite a wonderful and well-known India scholar. And actually, his academic work on India was acknowledged by the state of Israel just a few years ago when he received the state's highest honor, the Israel Prize. It's interesting what he did with the money from that prize. About 20 years ago, he started going out into the territories with this group called Ta'ayush. Ta'ayush means living together in Arabic. And this is an activist group that goes out and does what's called direct action. Direct action means actually helping people. And so there's Palestinians in certain parts who, for example, can't have access to their grazing fields or can't reach their wells, things like that. So my dad and his friends at Ta'ayush would go and simply be there with them so that they don't get attacked by Israeli settlers or soldiers, or prevented from doing the very basic things of life that they wanted to do. My dad changed my life when he started taking me out there with him, also almost 20 years ago. Mostly, and since then, he's been out there almost every single week. He's going to tell you about it. But almost every single week, he goes out there. He wakes up early in the morning and drives out and goes where these people need help. As during the course of this time, what happened was that the story of Israel kind of changed in my mind, and I think for him too. The story of Israel stopped being the story of moving from Waterloo to Jerusalem, the story of places like Tel Aviv or Kibbutz Ein Harod. It stopped being those kinds of places that we're used to thinking of as Israel, and it started being more about places like Susia, Tuane, Bir el-Eid, Silwan, Sheikh Jarrah, Palestinian villages that the activist work centered around. And the story of the people of Israel, of this country, changed from names that you might know, like Herzl, Golda, Rabin, Sharon, people like that, to the people who are there with him in these moments. People like Ezra, Arik, Guy, Amiel, and lots of the Palestinian friends that he's made over the years. There's a tremendous beauty that lies in these places. You'll see some pictures later. And there's a tremendous beauty that lies in these people, these Israeli activists. They're really kind of a gem. It's kind of an amazing thing. So in his writing, in his books that many of us have been reading and talking about over the last weeks, the tremendous beauty of Israel has been kind of reclaimed. It's kind of a miraculous thing. And so the love of that place lives on in large part through these places. So today I'm hoping that he's going to help us see something of the reality. He's going to help us shift our understanding of what the story of this place is. And he's going to give us this opportunity to reflect on where we stand. So, but before we get to my dad, Abba, I'm treating your words today as the Torah reading, basically. And so it's Shabbat morning, so we have a little preparation before we get there. So we have this beautiful tradition that we've developed during this festival of preparing for the Omer. We're preparing ourselves, so we're going to say the blessing for the counting of the Omer, these 50 days that we are in preparation for receiving the Torah. I'd like to invite Adam Zucker to lead us in the counting of the Omer.
Good morning, Rabbi. Good morning, everyone. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sefirat ha'omer.
Amen. Hayom 21 yamim, shehem 3 shavuot b'diuk la'omer. Today is 21 days to the Omer, which are exactly 3 weeks. So in lieu of, we're going to do actually, in the Saturday morning prayer service, it starts with lots and lots of Psalms. And when I asked my dad, what should we read? What should we read from the prophets or the Psalms or the Bible that might reflect that Judaism that he grew up with, the Judaism that is so deeply part of who he is, despite himself. He said, let's read one of the Psalms that has to do with justice. And I immediately thought, well, the name of this festival is called Kumah, and there is a Psalm, Psalm 82, from which I at least connect to that word Kumah. And shortly, Adam is going to read us a translation of this Psalm, and then afterwards, Gabriel, Adam's son, is going to play some music that will reflect on this Psalm and kind of bring us into the space. But I just want to say a word about this particular Psalm. It was just under a year ago when the whole country kind of went into an incredible moment, one of those incredible historic moments in which the Black Lives Matter movement emerged. During that time, during that whole month, I was obsessed with this one Psalm, Psalm 82. It felt like what was happening in the country was what the Psalm was describing. So you'll hear the Psalm in a translation, but here's the main point that I want to make about this Psalm, and that has to do with this festival and this word Kumah. In the song, we are told that the people rising together for the cause of justice, when people come together to rise for the cause of justice, that is what God means when God uses the word Elohim, God. In other words, the Hebrew word Elohim, the Hebrew word for God, actually has a connotation of human beings coming together to rise up for the right cause. That's what God is. Yeah, there's a line in there, Ani amarti Elohim atem. You can try saying that. Ani amarti Elohim atem. Which means, I'm telling you that when I say God, I mean you plural. Yeah, that's the psalmist speaks in the name of God. So the judge of the earth is the rising up of the people to do God's work, to do justice. So I pass it over to Adam and then to Gabriel to reflect on it musically with his piano. Bevakasha.
A song of gathering. God is present when we come together with purpose, judging from the heart of our testimony. How long will the burden of those killed for no reason stand over you? So long as you tolerate the faces of wickedness, judge like the accused had nothing and no one. Pull up the humble and the penniless. Snatch the destitute and the needy from the claws of the wicked. They did not know. They will never understand. Walk in the darkness. The foundations of the earth are on the verge of collapse. When I say God, I mean you, children of sky, every one of you. Yes, you will die like all people. You are not beyond life's rises and falls. This is your time. Rise up as God and judge the earth. Stream through the people like water.
Amen. Thank you, Gabriel. And thank you, Adam. I'd like to introduce you to two people. My dad, you already got the introduction, David Shulman. And the other person I want to introduce you to is Gili Getz. Gili's a friend and a comrade. Gili is always there whenever the Jewish left in New York is doing anything. He's a photographer, he's a playwright, he's an actor, and he's an activist, and he's spent lots of time both in Israel and Palestine and here working for justice. All these organizations that we speak about and that you've heard of from our Black Lives Matter Chevruta, for example, like Jay Fredge, Gili, I always see Gili there taking amazing photos. If not now, Gili is on the board of Combatants for Peace, the organization that did this incredible joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony a few days ago. So we're gonna hear from Gili soon. I've asked Gili to come to kind of moderate the discussion. It's one of his many strengths, and we're gonna hear from him. He's also gonna share some photos while my dad speaks. But I just wanted you to see who's sharing photos, and we'll also hear Gili say a word or two and ask some questions after my dad speaks. But Abba, so thank you, Gili, for being here, and Abba, thank you so much for being here from Yerushalayim. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Yeah, okay. So first of all, Shabbat Shalom to everybody, and good morning to those of you who are in those time zones. It's evening here. It's a real honor to be here. It's always very nice to be in the presence of the people of the new shul. I'm beginning to see faces that have become familiar to me. And I also have very close beloved friends whom I see here, and members of my family. My niece Margot has joined us, our Mechatanim, Diane and Rabbi, and Michael Posnick, Jim Punet, my Rebbe. In short, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you, Misha. I had the unnerving pleasure, rather moving experience of hearing myself being introduced by my son. Doesn't happen every day. And I was kind of interested to see what he chose to select. It's a particular version of my biography, not the only one. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, I think, something like that. I want to describe to you in a concrete and tangible way the kind of things that we do. We means the activists of Ta'ayush in the Palestinian territories. I've picked a particular case, one example just to begin with, because, well, for one thing, I was in this place, Uja, yesterday, so of course it's very much in my mind today as well. Usually when I go down there, it takes me about 24 hours just to recover from the intensity of the experience. I'll tell you the story of Uja. I picked it to begin with because it's, although it's not a simple story, it's not so easy, it's a lot less traumatic than some of the stories that I had considered sharing with you. So let me tell you about Uja. It's just a firsthand glimpse into the kind of things that that we do, and some way for you to have some sense, I hope, of the reality of the Israeli occupation. So Uja, actually, it's one of our success stories, or at least partial success stories. We don't have a whole lot of success stories, but this is one of them. Uja it's an area north of the city of Jericho. Jericho is in the territory of the Palestinian Authority. Uja, once a very popular place for hikers, Israeli hikers. Yeah, that's what it looks like. You can see it's dry.
I'd like to give a mind to Ahmed Erica.
Oh, look.
Yeah.
Photos. Oh, do you want to look on my computer?
Yeah.
Okay, I hope you can see the picture that Gili has put up. Everybody can see it? Okay. I don't have a lot of pictures from Uja, just a couple today, but this is from yesterday. So this is really straight from the front. Uja is not a single little hamlet. It's a conglomeration of little scattered encampments and tiny villages. There's Upper Uja and Lower Uja, and there's Noema, and there's Duke, and a whole set of other such places. It has a fairly large Palestinian population. These people are mostly shepherds, and sometimes they're also kind of small-scale farmers, and occasionally they also have day jobs working here and there, trying to scrape together a living. They are the poorest of the poor. Basically, all they have are their sheep and their goats. They live really close to the ground. I once asked one of my Palestinian friends from Uja if he was ever able to save any money. He laughed at me. That's something which is beyond him. They survive on a hand-to-mouth basis. They live off the herds. Their life was never easy. They've been there for many generations, by the way. The lands that are their grazing grounds and agricultural grounds are what are called Waqf lands. That is to say, they're endowed territory that belongs to the Muslim Endowment Board, which you might think should protect them from the depredations of the Israeli government and the army and the settlers, but in fact, that hasn't helped at all. And the story of Uja has to do with a particular man. His name is Omer Yedidia. He's a settler. He took over an abandoned army camp in this area about 15 or 16 years ago. And he unilaterally declared nearly the entirety of the grazing grounds, and that's a huge area, many hundreds of acres, at least that. He unilaterally declared that these grounds were now off limits to Palestinians. And he made it clear to the Palestinians from the Uja area that if they entered into these lands, in the middle of which was his farm or settlement, if they entered into these lands, he would chase them off at gunpoint and he might actually kill them. And they were terrified, with good reason. By the way, that agricultural farm in the middle of the Uja territory is illegal even under the very lenient standards of Israeli law. It's of course illegal under international law, but even in Israel, it's an illegal settlement. This man Omer himself, I kind of know him, I'm sorry to say. He sees himself as a kind of new age, hippie, spiritual type. But if you ask me, I would tell you he's kind of your ordinary run-of-the-mill thug or gangster, something like that. He's surrounded by a lot of young people who are mostly violent toughs. So years went by. For about 10, 11, 12 years, the Palestinians of Uja had absolutely no access to their grazing grounds whatsoever. At some point, they heard about us, about Ta'ayush, because over the years, we've had some success with land cases. That is success through a very long, painstaking process. We've had some success in getting the courts to confirm the ownership of the original proper owners, Palestinian owners, and actually restoring these lands that have been stolen by settlers or the state, restoring them to their actual owners. I can tell you what that process means, but we won't go into that now. I want you to hear the Uja story. If you're interested, I'll tell you later. So they heard that we'd had quite a lot of success like this, and they called us in. I was there that day. This is about 5 years ago. It was a hot summer day. All the elders of the Uja communities had come together to ask us, if we had any advice for them. And we said to them that we understood their situation. We understood that these lands have been made out of bounds to you. But if they were prepared to do this, we would take them back into these forbidden lands. We would be there beside them. And we told them, we can't promise anything. And of course, the decision was theirs, not ours. No question about that, because there's risk involved. We told them that initially, for the first period of maybe some weeks or months, or maybe even beyond that, it was going to be really hard. There would be violence. People would be hurt. They'd be hurt by the settlers. They'd be beaten up by the soldiers and the police. There would be arrests. It would go on like that for some time. But that if they were able to stick it out, and we would be with them at every step, then there was a good chance that they would be able to regain access to some portion of their lands. So they were extremely ambivalent about this. They were scared to death, and with good reason. We actually went from household to household after the original meeting, and they repeated this. I can tell you that the Palestinian shepherds who lived relatively close to Omer's settlement, they were the most terrified, of course. And it was a hard decision for them to make. But eventually they said, okay, we'll do it. And they set to meet with us on a Friday morning at 6:30 in the morning. It's in the summer. You have to get out really early in the summer because it's so hot in the Jordan Valley. So we came down 6:30 in the morning, but they didn't show up. You can see that they were ambivalent and afraid. Actually, they were really, really scared. So we spoke to them and asked them what they wanted to do. They said, well, let's try again next week. And indeed, that next week, Friday morning, this time they were there with the sheep and the goats. And we went into the forbidden zone. And I was there. I can tell you it was a very moving moment. These shepherds, these are tough people. They live a really rough life, and they've been through everything. They're you could say they're kind of gentle and soft-hearted people in a way, but their exterior is really tough. But they cried. I saw these shepherds break down and cry because they had given up any hope that they would ever see these lands again, let alone set foot in them. And then things developed just exactly as we said they would. That is, things became very difficult. The settlers would attack. There were some brutal attacks. People were hurt. The army would send soldiers in the middle of the night into their encampments. They would wake everybody up and beat everybody up, men, women, and children. And they would sometimes also shoot some of the sheep and the goats for good measure. And there were also arrests and the legal problems and the whole thing that is, by the way, just standard fare. That's the way things run in the occupied territories. Then something good happened. I can see you already beginning to look a little discouraged. So here's the good news. What happened was that after about 6 months, the army brigade that was stationed around that area and was responsible for security in that area, that brigade was transferred somewhere else, and a new unit came in, and the commanding officer of that unit, he was a religious settler, which does not bode well, but actually turned out to be a rational human being. And after a while, when he could sort of see what the situation was like, he called our people in. I wasn't there that day, but he called our people in, my friends, and he said to them, let's put an end to these constant weekly or daily clashes, this useless friction. Let's draw a map which will define where the Palestinians are allowed to be and where Omer and his settlers are going to be. And that should maybe solve the problem for the moment. And he put my friends in an army jeep, and they traveled through this whole huge area, putting down markers, boundary markers to demarcate the limits. And after that, there were still problems at the beginning. There was a lot of ambiguity in some of the places, but on the whole, what happened was that the Palestinian shepherds of Uja got back about 90% of their lands. That for us was like a tremendous victory. It's not the only such victory we've had, but still it was a tremendously satisfying thing to see. And it meant that these people had a life again. They could live their life. And for about 6 months, things were kind of really peaceful, and we turned our attention elsewhere. I mean, I suppose I should tell you, there are emergency humanitarian situations every single day in the occupied territories in the West Bank, and there's plenty of work for all of us to do, and there are not enough of us. So, I mean, we had other things to do. We didn't really have to be with them very much in Uja during those happy 6 months. And then the inevitable happened, which was that Omer, who happens to be very well connected, he came out, I think, of one of the fancy combat units in the army. He eventually got through to the Minister of Defense or to the Chief of Staff or to some other high-ranking officer or to the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, I don't know. And they transferred this enlightened army officer to somewhere else. And what that meant in practice was that we had to start all over again from the beginning, which we did. So what's the situation today? It's been about 5 years. The situation is as follows. The Palestinians in Uja, they do have access to a big chunk of their lands, not 90%, but there's a lot of their land which is now open to them, and they can take their flocks out. On the other hand, they're subject to constant harassment by Omer and his rather violent followers, and sometimes by the soldiers and sometimes by the police. And sometimes it's really very severe harassment. I can give you all kinds of details if you want it. I was there 2-3 weeks ago. Well, here just as an example, they built a road in the middle of this area. It's a newly paved road, and the army arbitrarily decided, totally arbitrarily, that on the left side of the road, that is to say to the south, Palestinians were not going to be allowed to take their flocks anymore, even though these are their lands. Again, I want to say, these are their lands of the Waqf. They could graze to the right of the road. The only problem with that is that the good grazing grounds, that is the rich green grasses that the sheep and the goats mostly need, guess where they are? They're of course on the left side of the road, so they have no access there unless we go there with them, which is what I've been doing the last few times that I've been down there. So when I was there 3 weeks ago, there was like this tremendous lush green foliage grass. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. The sheep and the goats were in heaven. The shepherds were happy too. That was on the forbidden side of the road, right? Then the settlers, they sent up one of their drones. This has become a new thing that the settlers have. Listen, you have to understand, the settlers, they're into harassment. There's a certain logic to it. Aside from the fact that they hate Palestinians, they also want to drive them out. The whole idea is to expel this population from everywhere that they can possibly make them leave. So now they have these drones. These are run by the settlers. The army also has its drones, but it's the settlers who use them in order to scatter the sheep. The sheep are terrified when this drone, drones like descend upon them like that. It's a really scary thing. The sheep scatter all over the place. Then the settlers have to go collect them. Not that the shepherds have to go and collect them on the hills, and they have to usually leave that area. It happened when I was there. Actually, this time, the shepherds managed to somehow hold the sheep in a kind of coherent body mass until the drone finally stopped about half an hour or so of this raid. When it was over, the soldiers turned up, which is what they have a habit of doing. And there was a woman soldier who addressed my friend, the shepherd, Jamal. She didn't talk to us. She didn't really talk to him either. She kind of barked a supercilious order at him. She looked at him and she said 3 words. She said, "Don't be here." And my friend said, my friend who was with me there, he said, "That's it. That's kind of the essence of Zionism. Zionist history summed up in 3 short words. Don't be here." Then she left. So the same thing happened yesterday, actually, because it was so hot. And by now, these beautiful, lush green grasses have mostly dried up. It's going to be summer, and the shepherds are going to have to buy food in the cities, in Nablus or someplace, until the rains come in sometime like November, October, November. These are hard months for them. It's also Ramadan and they're fasting. So anyway, by the time we got there, they were on the wrong side of the road from the point of view of the army. We joined them there. Things went well for a little while, but then it got to be really hot, too hot even for the sheep. And they were fasting and they were tired, the shepherds, and they were anyway about to head home by around 11 in the morning. It was at that time that the soldiers arrived and they tried to drive them off, which is what they always do. In theory, they're supposed to produce a piece of paper which is called a closed military zone order. If they don't have that piece of paper, it's completely illegal to do that. Even if they have the piece of paper, it's illegal according to the ruling of the Israeli Supreme Court from 2004. But anyway, they didn't have the closed military zone order yesterday, but they didn't really need it because the shepherds were anyway ready to go home. That's the Uja story. This is a success story in the sense that these people can still live there. They're still there despite the immense pressures that are brought to bear by the government, by the army, of course, by the settlers who are these kind of outer face, the outer surface of the occupation. Despite all of that, they're still there. And this is because these shepherds have the astonishing resilience to face this kind of life. And that's the life that they want. They don't want to go to any other place. They don't want to immigrate. They want to live their life on their own lands. And we're there to try to help them do that. That's what Ta'ayush does. It's not the only thing that we do. We go with shepherds, we go with farmers, we help them harvest their crops. We stand between them and the settlers who often come down with their guns in order to chase them off. Sometimes there are very violent incidents. All of us have been beaten, shot at, the whole picture many times. But we've had a lot of success in the sense that again, in South Hebron, in the South Hebron Hills, like in the Jordan Valley, these people are still there. There's just one other thing I want to say before I stop this kind of introduction. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and to having a conversation. Actually, there are two things that I think I need to say. First of all, you need to know that the grassroots Palestinian leadership in all of these places, without exception, throughout the West Bank, these are people who are committed to nonviolent resistance to the occupation. The Palestinian mainstream in general has accepted this notion. It took a long time, but that's the way things are. But on the level of the villages, I've known a lot of the leaders of these places like Susia and Tuane and El Khair, all kinds of places in the Jordan Valley. These are people who know by experience that violence works against them. And aside from that, many of them have the, how shall I say it? They have the deep commitment to the notion of nonviolent resistance as the moral and ethical way to fight injustice. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind in general, it's not an easy thing for me to say, but I'll say it anyway and then I'll stop. There are about 14 million people now west of the Jordan River, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And they're divided almost evenly. There's parity between the Palestinian and the Israeli Jewish population now, half and half. Out of those 14 million people, 7 million, the Israeli Jews, including the settlers, they have all the normal human rights that, most of you take for granted. I don't know if you take them as easily for granted after 4 years of Trump, but maybe you do, I don't know. But anyway, the basic human rights, that is to say some sense of security of property, security of life, freedom of movement, you're able to vote, In the case of Israeli Jews, there's also health insurance for absolutely everybody. There's national insurance. I mean, it's, and above all, there's access to the Israeli courts, which do offer justice if you happen to be Jewish. But the other half, the other 7 million Palestinians, that includes to some extent the minority of Arabs, citizens of Israel, although they do have access to the courts and they can vote in the elections. Let's just say, let's take the 5 to 6 million Palestinians who are on the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. They have no rights at all. They have zero rights. You have to take that in and understand what it means. They can be attacked, they can be killed by settlers with impunity. Settlers almost never are brought to court. Their property can be taken from them at every moment. They have no access to the Israeli civil courts for the most part. I could qualify that station. Usually though, Palestinians on the West Bank come before the military courts. What that means is that there's absolutely no chance, zero chance that they will find justice in those courts. Somebody once said that military justice is to justice as military music is to music. It's kind of like that. The conviction rate of Palestinians who come before the military courts is around 98%. And I'll tell you just one short little anecdote. There was a time, a few years ago, I was out with these shepherds. A friend of mine was in the South Hebron Hills, on Palestinian land, of course. Eventually the soldiers came and chased them off the land, into the desert, actually, and we went with them. We follow the lead of our Palestinian hosts, of course. It's never a question of our trying to make them resist an order like the closed military zone order if they don't want to. Anyway, they chased us off into the desert, but then these 2 young soldiers came. They were about 18, 19 years old, I don't know. And they came, they wanted to talk to us, me and my friend, because in their eyes, we're like people who have dropped onto this planet from another planet, say Mars, something like that. What are we doing? These Jews who are helping the Palestinians, So they, they came to talk to us about that, and we were happy to talk to them. And they said, what are you doing here? We said, well, we're trying to protect these people from you, people like you. They said, people like us, we're here to defend democracy. These are 18-year-old kids, right? They've grown up with the occupation. The occupation was already 30 years old or 40 years old when they were born. So I said to them, I said, democracy, you're here to defend democracy. Doesn't democracy usually mean that, people can vote like in an election, in a free election for their own representatives? So they said, yeah. They said, that's of course what I mean. So I said, well, yeah, so who can these people vote for, do you think? We're talking about Area C in the West Bank, which is where the settlements are located. I asked them, who can these people vote for? So this was a new thought. They'd never had this thought before, and they thought for a little while. They're kind of confused by it. After about 5 minutes, one of them said to me, I don't know who they can vote for, but there's got to be somebody they can vote for. But of course, that's not the case, right? They have no, actually, just to put it really simply, we're talking about maybe 6 million people who have no human rights whatsoever. And that's the reality today. It's an agony for me to even have to say those words. I think though that, you can hear me talk about it, but were you to come, any of you were to come down with me to Uja or Twane or any of these other places, within half an hour, you would see for yourself and there'd be no doubt left in your mind. I guess that's a place where I can stop for now.
Thank you. Before I invite Gili to say a few words, I just have a question for you that I'd like I'd like to put to you, because I have Matan here, my eldest. You're one of almost a dozen grandchildren that my dad has, and I'm wondering. I'm just sitting here trying to hear this through his ears, and my question to you is, what would you like Matan to take from this? What should a teen, almost teen, person, Jewish person with family in Israel, Jewish American, what would you like him to take from this? He's here listening.
Oh, hi, Matani.
Hi.
Hi. Matan's going to be bar mitzvah in the fall. So I guess that means, Matan, you're going to become an adult, a man, according to the Jewish way of thinking about those things. I wouldn't expect you, Matani, to like take on the whole heavy package that I have in my mind or my heart, but I can tell you what I think. And that is this: we're in a hard situation in Israel. We have this state that the Jews kind of miraculously achieved, and the state was a gift, and maybe still is a gift in some way, but it's in a really terrible shape. And what that means is that our generation, but also your generation, the generation that is coming into adulthood now, like Matan, we have the privilege and also the duty to save this state from itself. And that means a kind of struggle. And there are many forms that struggle can take. I'm not saying everybody has to come down with me to Uja, although we need people. We really need people there. But there are many ways to resist and to seek an Israel which will be a place of justice, like in the beautiful psalm that we just heard a few moments ago. That's what I would want to say to Matani, and actually to all my other grandchildren. Some of them are already pretty close to this.
Here he is. There's a visual. Okay, sorry. I had to bring the Matan question in because for him, it's much harder these days to wake up at such an hour on a Saturday, and I need to release him to go have breakfast. Unless you have a question. You got any questions? No. Okay, great. So, yes. So thank you for taking that, Abba. Matan, close the door, please. I want to pass it on to Gili, and to hear Gili kind of reflect on this and maybe ask some questions. In the meantime, while Gili is speaking, please start thinking of which questions you'd like to ask to my dad in particular, to Gili as well. And you can put them in the chat. Gili and I are going to kind of watch them and try and field them. But I pass it on to Gili Getz.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi, and Shabbat Shalom, the new be here and be there on Shabbat Yom Ha'atzmaut, and you time a partner at the joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony. The ceremony was extraordinary, and you hear me?
Not very well, actually. It's breaking up.
So if he can turn off his video, usually that'll help the sound.
Maybe
Oh, can
while
you hear me? Can you hear me now? I think
there we
something.
go. Yes.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So happy to be here. And thank you for the new show for joining us at the Joint Memorial, Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Ceremony. My story is a little bit the opposite. I grew up 40 minutes from the South Hebron Hills. I never knew anything about it. Even after my military service, I came back and learned about the South Hebron Hill, Susia and El-Khair, in the villages under a demolition threat here in America. And then I went back home and went to visit those villages, and also was part of the delegation of the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, the biggest diaspora delegation to come to the South Hebron Hills for direct action and coalition with Israelis and Palestinians. And that was an extremely transformative experience in being here. And this a question of what's the role of the diaspora Jews in the conflict is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and has been driving me for a very long time. And celebrate for me now. From the point I started, where there were no such thing as Palestinians. There were just Arabs all around us trying to kill us. And, we're fighting for our freedom and for our safety, to realization that there is such a thing as a Palestinian people, to the realization that there are specific Palestinians with specific struggles, like in Area C, like in those villages. In that process, celebrating Israel became something different for me. It's celebrating works of organization like Ta'ayush. That became a part of what's celebrating Israel, and the realization that the story of Israel, the story of our people, of our own liberation, of our own freedom, is deeply intertwined with the people in the village of Susia, with the people in the village of El-Khair. These are not two separate stories or somehow conflicting stories. This is the exact same story. And that's something that I spend time trying to figure out, both for myself and my politics. And I think the one thing that was not mentioned is how unique is Ta'ayush in the this development of a Israeli-Palestinian joint resistance, where we stand together for democracy, for justice, for equality. That's something that was really not developed. And I think Ta'ayush, and David, if you can touch on that for 1 second, on the genesis of this work, because this Ta'ayush has led to a culture and a model that is adopted by younger activists now, who are developing joint resistance. Obviously, this is on a very small scale, but the model itself keeps developing and existing. So David, if you can touch on the genesis of Ta'ayush and how you find yourself in the South Hebron Hills doing this work.
Yeah, I'll be happy to tell this story. The story goes something like this. I, like many of my friends, I was involved in the peace movement in the late 70s, early 80s, Peace Now. I marched in the demonstrations, all of those kinds of things that we used to do. In those days, the Peace Now movement actually was a fabulous success, set the agenda, you might say, for the Israeli sort of political world. But at the, things became very difficult at the time of the first Intifada. And when the second Intifada broke out in October of 2000, I wasn't in Israel at the time. I was spending a year in Berlin, but friends of mine, activists, they went up to pay a condolence call in the village of El-Fahim, a village near Haifa. There had been, after the violence broke out, there were riots in El-Fahim, and the police shot 13 demonstrators, killed them. So anyway, these activists went up there, and on their way back to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, they stopped for coffee in Kafr Qasim, a well-known Palestinian village. And they asked themselves, what is needed now? What is it that we are called upon to do right now? And they said, you know, demonstrations are okay, we need demonstrations and all that, but actually we need to be in the territories physically in order to protect the civilian Palestinian population with our bodies, with our presence, because if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. And, you know, I'm a little ashamed to say that we should have realized this long ago. I lived in Israel for many decades before I even knew what life was like for a Palestinian on the West Bank. The only Palestinians I knew were people who were sweeping the streets or working on the building sites. I didn't have any Palestinian friends. I did an undergraduate degree in Arabic. None of my teachers even considered it worth thinking about, that there were actual human beings that one could talk to in this language, you know, in spoken Arabic. We learned literary Fusha Arabic. And we didn't realize, the main thing was that we didn't realize that if we weren't going to be there, nobody else was going to assume that role. We thought, well, you know, the police are there, the army are there, and the occupation forces, they're supposed to take care of the civilian population. But when it became very clear to us that that was not the case, so that was the beginning of Ta'ayush, and it became very rapidly, right at the beginning, became a joint Israeli-Palestinian movement. In the beginning, I mean, these were very, very difficult conditions. It's not like we had hundreds of volunteers at any given moment. You know, the first time I went down to South Hebron, there were 250 activists went down there to bring blankets to these Palestinians whose houses had been destroyed by the army. We had huge numbers of people with us by today's standard. Today, we're talking about a handful of activists that are still there on the ground. But that's how it began. And it became, for me, a transformative experience. And I think I would have to say that for me personally, this is just me, I couldn't live in Israel if it were not for Ta'ayush. I would not be able to live with myself if I were not able to go into the territories and do at least the little that I can do. It's not very much, as a way of trying to just do the right thing, the human thing, and also to resist the horrible things that are being inflicted upon innocent civilians all the time.
Thank you so much, David. Before we open it to questions, and there's a bunch of requests to show more photos. I'll show some of the photos while you answer. If you want to comment on any of them, a lot of them are in your book. And if you haven't read it, it's really extraordinary. This is an extraordinary piece of history in the peace work and anti-occupation work in Israel. And this weekend there were Jews and Arab protesting in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, another feature of the occupation to remove Palestinians from their homes and from their lands. You write in your book, kind of counterintuitive to some of the politics here in America. You write in the book, what drives you is despair. That one of the things that gets you going is despair itself. And I find that often despair is something that people here, at least, disengaged. The fact that things are bad and getting worse is the reason to just walk away, because here we're really more, we have that option, and your average Israeli has that option too. You just walk away from the conflict, walk away from all that, or think they do. So if you can touch a little bit about that, how, looking into a lot of the things in the book, in the occupation, you rely on a kind person to do something because the legal structure doesn't allow you, but you need to find this one person that has a kind heart versus a system that just crushing down. So a little bit about that, looking into that reality and have that energize you to act versus to walk away. And I'll show some photos in the meanwhile, that's okay, and just jump in if you see something you want to talk about.
I'm glad there'll be photos. There's nothing like the visual to make the point. It's better than words. My friend Jim Ponetto, I think, is here with us. He said to me years ago about myself, he said, you're not despairing. You've like gone beyond despair many times over, and I think that may be the case. I mean, despair. There are different kinds of despair. There's the despair that paralyzes you and that makes you want to just kind of cuddle up somewhere in a dark corner and wait for the horrible things to disappear. But there's a kind of a despair that is definitely capable of activating a person who wants to somehow do the right thing, even if he knows or she knows that the results are likely to be very unsatisfying, that they won't work. That's another element in all of this. It has to do with the nature of an ethical act or a moral act. You know, we're of course interested in the consequences of our actions, and we want to win whenever we can win. But actually one acts, I think, in a moral cause, first and foremost, because of the intrinsic value of doing it, without thinking too much about the results. In fact, if you think too much about the results, you'll be paralyzed and you won't be able to act. You have to do it because you're doing your best and it's the right thing to do, and because you don't know what the consequences and the reverberations of an ethical act will be. I've seen many instances over the years in which some seemingly trivial or insignificant movement, action, word, a sentence here or there changed somebody's life. So that's a different kind of despair than the kind of dark, passive, paralyzing despair. And I think that, like other things in life, like other emotions, like fear, for example, you know, fear is a problem, but you have to learn how to work with your fear, learn how to deal with it. It's something that you learn. Similarly with despair, depends what you do with it once it's there.
And in South Hebron Hills, we see Palestinians really holding on to their land in the most unimaginable way there. I learned the existence is resistance. Just existing on your land day after day is itself an act of resistance. And that is something that is deeply inspiring in the South Hebron Hills that I learned. So maybe we'll touch on some of the questions that are coming up in the chat. Let me just see. Should we unmute or just ask the questions?
I think we can just kind of read them. I'm seeing one from Amy, who's asking, where's this hate coming from? Why there's so much hate in your description coming from the settlers and also from lots of people in Israel? Why is that?
Oh, why do some settlers hate Arabs, you mean, hate Palestinians? Before I answer that question, the first thing I have to say is that there's a lot of settlers. Depends how you want to count them. Let's say that there are 400,000 or something like that in the territories today. I don't really like to generalize about them because, like any other group of people, they're rather heterogeneous. There are a lot of idealistic people who, among the settlers, who are very much opposed to violence. You know? I mean, I think they're wrong to be where they are, wrong to be living there. But I by no means would want to imply that all the Israeli settlers are violent hooligans like the ones that I tend to meet on the Hill. Still, there is a rather significant group among them, maybe 50,000 or 60,000, who are indeed extraordinarily violent, and they are motivated by hate. Where the hate comes from, I don't know. Human beings have hate. It's funny, it's something we don't really sort of take, we seem to think we need to explain why hate is there. It doesn't occur to us to try to explain why love might be there. You know, people have love. It's a part of being human, right? There's love. We don't ask ourselves, what is it that makes us love? But hate, because it's such an uncomfortable thing and possibly very destructive, you know, we always look for some kind of reason. But maybe hate is just built into the human being, and it can be, you know, conscripted to various nefarious purposes all too easily, as all of us have seen in the last years, A lot of the settlers, the ones that I tend to meet, as distinct from the soldiers, by the way, they tend to be racist, and they're kind of heavily literalist. They think that God, they're religious, a lot of them, they think that God was a real estate agent, basically, and he gave the Jews a document saying that the land belonged to them and only to them. It's an exclusive kind of thing. It's a very primitive notion of God, I guess, but that's what they have. So given that, might hate the people who are standing in the way of, as it were, standing in the way. The truth is that the Palestinian population on the West Bank is not an obstacle, but anyway, there's a wish to drive them out, and it's motivated by kind of racist sense of superiority. It's a very ugly thing.
And for technical reasons, they want to remove Palestinians from the land so they can annex the land without Palestinians. That's one of the issues in Area C, that there are Palestinians there. And one of the plans of organizations like Regavim, who are NGOs who are working to make the lives of Palestinians living there hell, is to remove them or make them leave so they can have areas free of Palestinians. That's one of the strategic plans. So we have great questions coming in. One is, do you have anybody sympathetic in the Israeli government or in the Israeli structure that you have somebody that you can talk to in kind of the structure of it? In another question, just pick the one you can intertwine them. I think it's important. What's the best way for American Jews to convey what's happening to others, and especially non-Jews, so they raise awareness about the humanitarian crisis without sounding like they're anti-Israel, or I would add anti-Semitic, right? That's the thing that's thrown at people who bring this issue up. So these two questions: do you have an ally in the structure, in the system, and what should American Jews do, and non-Jews?
There are people within the political system, but even in the Knesset, there are people who are very much, think along the lines that I would want. The Meretz party for actually many years, decades, has been embodying this kind of vision, kind of liberal, humane, humanitarian vision of the world. And they're very explicitly against the occupation. Actually, among the Jewish parties, the Meretz is the only one which has been unequivocally opposed to the occupation, and explicitly so. But there are other voices, even within the political system, who are somehow close to ours. And if I look beyond the Jewish parties, so we now have the United Arab List, which is headed by a very unusual man, wonderful man, Ayman Odeh. He's an articulate and very clear-headed person, and his values are my values. And I actually tend to believe that if change, significant change, is ever to come to the political system, which, as all of you probably know, has been stuck for the last 2 years, miserably stuck, that change could only come really from a deep partnership between somebody like Odeh and his party and what's left of the Israeli left, like Meretz and maybe even the old Labor Party. Aside from that, though, I meet people all the time, even the army officers. There's all kinds of people who share the basic values that I've been, speaking about here. The funny thing about Israel, there's a sort of paradox. On the one hand, Israel is very much of a right-wing country. The Israeli right, especially including the religious right, it has a built-in advantage in electoral terms, and it's only becoming more so for all kinds of demographic reasons and other reasons. So it's a right-wing country, and I would say, ask me, I would say that even the Israeli center and the parts of the Israeli left have been, let's use the word, infected by the disease of modern hypo-ethnic status nationalism. It's a disease. However, having said that, it's also the case that resistance in the name of the great human values, resistance to the occupation and to everything that it stands for, and to the right-wing vision of reality, resistance to it is still very strong in Israel. You know, I was at the demonstration yesterday in Sheikh Jarrah. It's really an amazing thing. There were something like 500, maybe 600 people came to protest the eviction of these Palestinians from their homes. And a lot of these people are young people. It's wonderful to see. There are people like me, you know, we're like kind of the old guard now, but there are people in their teens and their 20s and early 30s full of passion. And these are people who are committed and prepared to act and will not be silent. And, you know, we could talk about the protests against Bibi, which produced like massive resistance throughout the country. So, I mean, one way to say it is to say that there's a very high density in Israel of really fantastic human beings who are prepared to take the risks involved in actually resisting evil. A high density of such people. Also numerically, maybe, you know, by comparison with other societies, maybe there's quite a lot. I think that the resistance in Israel is strong and has a future. Actually, I think in the end we'll win, but I don't know if I'll live to see it. Now the other question. Yeah, that's an important, really important question. So, okay, so what can American Jews do? So if you ask me, if you share the basic humanitarian values, which are also, in my view of the world, the basic Jewish values about freedom and the dignity of human beings and, you know, nonviolence and compassion, love and openness to the world, love for the other. If you have those kinds of values and you're concerned about what is happening and has been happening in Israel, so all of you people live in a democracy. There are many ways for you to make that opinion heard or present. You can, there's the media, the social media, there are the newspapers, you have congressmen, you can write to the White House. You know, I think that actually in the old days, during the Obama administration, we had a kind of indirect line to the president himself, you know, through to Aish. We were able to save the village of Susia partly because of that. So I think that somebody who's prepared to actually make their feelings and ideas known in relation to Israeli policy, you have many avenues to do it. And I would really warmly recommend that you use them. We need that support. Israel may not have, at least in the short run, the internal resources necessary to make the change. It needs help from outside, and especially from the Jewish community. The American Jewish community in general, the world Jewish community, it has a role to play in this. There's a struggle, you could put it like this, you could say there's a struggle going on for the soul of the Jewish people. The soul of the Jewish people, it's a good soul. Basically, it's a really good soul, but it's in a bad way. And it's involved in all kinds of terrible things. You want to save the soul of the Jewish people, then all of us have to be part of that effort today. That's our duty, and that's also our privilege. As to the anti-Semitism thing, I do not think it's so hard to make the differentiation. Being opposed to Israeli government policy is not in any way an anti-Semitic act. And anybody who, you know, is somehow connected to this domain of thought and feeling knows that very well. It's only people like Netanyahu who thinks that anybody who opposes his policies or who opposes the occupation is anti-Semitic. It's a crazy and horrible idea. And it's really important to make that distinction clear. It should not be so hard to make it clear.
Thank you, David. And I want to echo that I hear from lawmakers all the time that they hear from right-wing Jews nonstop. They do not hear enough from progressive Jews when it comes to Israel. And that's something that's on us. You know, we don't, for some reason, the right has been very good at getting their face in front of lawmakers and telling them the Jewish community would like to be hawkish on Israel. And we are doing much better job than we did before with J Street and a lot of other advocacy groups. But we definitely have the work cut out for us. And Susia is a great example of a great success of saving a village from demolition because of outside pressure. There's a great question here. I mean, there's a lot of great questions here. I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them, but I think this one goes directly to the book. What is the role of the PA helping the Palestinians? Aren't they under the jurisdiction of the PA? So this confusion that the PA runs the show, especially in Area C. So if you can clear up for us, what's the role in the PA in all this, especially when it comes to the South Hebron Hills?
Okay, so the Palestinian Authority, they have full control over what's called Area C, and they have partial authority over what's called Area B, which is a mixed zone. And they also feel themselves to be responsible to some extent for what's happening to the Palestinian population in Area C. I have to say, from the perspective, like from a ground zero perspective, that's my perspective. I'm no political commentator. I'm a grassroots activist. From my perspective, it took the PA a long time, a really long time, to even notice the fact that the Palestinians of Susia and Tuana and the South Hebron Hills needed help. They were on the whole more or less indifferent to them. We're talking about people who live in Ramallah, and they live a pretty good life in Ramallah or places like that. And they're very far away from the shepherds and the farmers that I meet every week. You know, they now, however, this I can say, they've now come to see that they have a role in articulating and presenting the Palestinian case for the civilian population in Area C. Mahmoud Abbas went to Susia a couple of years ago and gave a rather wonderful speech in which he said, among other things, an interesting thing, and this is important. He said, you know, that the way that people in Susia are resisting the occupation, resisting the constant encroachments by the settlers, the stealing of the lands, the whole scenario, the way they have adopted, which is the Ta'ayush pattern. He said, Mahmoud Abbas, that's the way to go. That's what we now, all of us, believe in. And so there now is a certain, what shall we say, but there's a kind of presence, a symbolic presence of the Palestinian Authority also in Area C. However, I do think it's important to say that the Palestinian Authority, it's a very weak organization. Basically, it would not be unfair to describe it as a kind of subcontractor for the Israeli intelligence services. That's what it's been doing since the, since the PA was constituted in the territories in the late 90s in the context of the Oslo agreements. I think that the PA as a whole would be potentially a very good partner for a peace deal if Israel wanted such a deal, but that doesn't it doesn't remove the fact that they're weak, and you know that the Palestinian population as a whole. I mean, it's a weak political situation. Israel has also done whatever it could to keep it weak. That's another thing. So that's a problem. They're having elections next month. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. I don't know what'll happen.
Yeah, there's elections next month if they happen, and there's a lot of buzz around what's going to happen. Is going to infuse some energy into a young Palestinian leadership that emerges. That's what we're looking for. That young Palestinian leadership that is like in Israel, is not given a lot of room to emerge, but hopefully it will. Well, thank you so much. We're running out of time. We have an amazing set of questions, which we're not going to get to, unfortunately. Rabbi, to you, I give the mic back to you. Honored to be here again.
Thank you both, and thank you everybody for all these questions. They need to be answered, all these questions, and we're going to keep talking about it. So rest assured. Somebody asked, I think Sasha asked about the future and solution and things like that. I think she's curious more than what my dad has to say than what I have to say, but I can tell you I've spoken about it with him, and I think the future is the future is really right now the struggle for equality. And I think that's a big piece of understanding what the future is. But we are here in the business of prayer as well as understanding. And Gabriel is going to help us pray in a certain way. Yeah. So we spoke about the future. We spoke about reality. We spoke some about the past. Now let's pray. Let's try and collect. Gabriel is going to try and express some of what we all got going on through his fingers, and then we're gonna come together again once he's done for a couple closing things. Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Gabriel. That's kind of how we're feeling, I think. At least me. Before we say Kaddish and close out, I'm going to pass it on to Maya, who's got some announcements for next week.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It's hard to talk after all of that. Thank you so much, David and Gili, for such a moving, important conversation. This morning, we're beyond grateful to you for joining us. You've left us eager to learn more and inspired to take action for justice. Thank you, Misha, for bringing your dear father to us, and thank you for you. I'd also like to thank Gabriel for translating, transforming our emotions and our thoughts into sound, into beautiful music. Thank you so much. Boy, this has been really an extraordinary gathering. Finally, for the thank yous, I'd like to thank Susan Myers, our executive director, for all that you do for us, Susan, to you and your team, including your son, Jonathan, for making these events so lively and seamless. Please join us next Friday. The Kumah Festival continues. Friday night, April 23rd at 8 p.m. I will be moderating, as I'm telling you about this event now. The evening will be devoted to dance, that most evanescent of arts, as we welcome two wonderful and significant dance artists, Sarah Chen and David Shulman. Sarah is an improviser and will perform a live improvisation for us on Zoom. She describes herself as a mixed race, pansexual, Jewish but interfaith raised, half Chinese granddaughter of immigrants, woman of color. Her work centers on issues of identity and building dialogue. Deva will bring us excerpts from her work CJ, dedicated to her nephew CJ, who was the victim of a fatal asthma attack, the result of medical and environmental racial disparities. A powerful work. Musically, we'll be joined by the great Frank London of the Klezmatics. The Kumah Festival will continue beyond that on Friday, the following Friday night, April 30th, with an exciting Young Curators Evening with Talia Feldberg, Haley Gawanter, and Avia Hernstadt. They will take us deep into politics, ritual, and the artistry of food. And the following Friday evening, May 7th, we'll ask the question, what is the symbol of Jewish redemption in our generation? A focus on visual imagery with Rabbi Misha and artist Giora Aharoni, Suzanne Tick, and Cody Humans. Our final event on Sunday evening, May 16, will be outdoors, socially distanced at Pier 65 Manhattan, featuring a live performance by David Shulman and saxophonist composer Mike McGinnis, and the creation of a collaborative work of art led by artist Suzanne Tick. All of this not to be missed. If you haven't registered already, please do, and we look forward to seeing you then very much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks so much, Maya. I invite you to, if you're thinking of anyone in particular, to speak their name out loud or put their names in the chat. I'm going to mention just one person today, and that's our friend and teacher who passed away a few months ago, Ezra Nawi. And if you are in mourning, I invite you to rise to speak the words of the Kaddish with me. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל לשמי דקודשה, בריך הוא, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ועל כל יושבי תבל, ואמרו אמן. Thank you so much, everybody. תודה רבה. Thank you to all of you. And I look forward to seeing you again on Friday. And I think we're gonna end with our Kumah song one more time. תודה רבה.
1, 2, 3, 4. Kumah, 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 Elohim. 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 שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. Kumah, 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 Elohim. Kumah, 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 Elohim. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. שופטי הארץ, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ, שופטי, שופטי, שופטי הארץ. מקום, 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 מקום האלוהים, 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 מקום, 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 מקום האלוהים.
תודה רבה, everybody. שבת שלום.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank
Shabbat
you.
Shalom.
Thank you, Misha and Susan. Thank you, David and
Thank you.
Gili, and it's brilliant.
And Gabe.
And Gabe.
Yeah.
Oh my
Beautiful,
God.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Shabbat Shalom and
Maya
thanks
and
for
Judi
all.
and Susan.
Thank you. It was so moving.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, and thank you. What a wonderful contribution today has been.
Yes. Oh my God. This is a much of a richness, this beautiful, beautiful festival. Be well, everyone.
Well, Ellen and Danielle, thank you.